For 8 years he had dwelt in solitude, conversing only with his mounts and the howling wind. Yet when 10 Apache women materialized at his threshold on that tempestuous evening, pleading for refuge, Tobias Redmond would confront the most difficult decision of his existence. The men pursuing them had already drawn close enough to detect the smoke rising from his hearth. The downpour struck the timber shutters like rifle fire, each impact serving as a warning of why sensible people remained indoors when the elements turned savage. Tobias occupied his spot beside the flames, repairing a worn harness when the pounding began. This wasn't the courteous knock of a friend. It carried desperation, urgency, the sound of souls with nowhere left to turn. He stiffened, leather still gripped in his palms. No one visited his homestead, not anymore, not since he'd made clear that Tobias Redmond desired no contact with the world beyond his property lines. The hammering resumed, more forceful now, joined by voices speaking a tongue he knew but hadn't heard in years. Apache. His pulse froze. The previous time he'd heard that language, his wife and child still drew breath. The last time strangers had arrived at his entrance after dark, he'd interred everything precious come dawn. His palm moved automatically toward the firearm mounted over the hearth, reflexes from evenings when slumber came with vigilant awareness. Yet something halted him. Perhaps it was the quality of the voices, not battle cries or threats, but something resembling entreaty. Perhaps it was how the gale carried their words, fractured and desperate. Or perhaps the realization that warriors rarely announce themselves through knocking. He moved toward the massive oak barrier, each footfall deliberate and cautious. Through the solid timber, he could distinguish them more clearly now. Female voices speaking in hushed, pressing tones. One voice elevated above the rest, speaking English with an inflection that made every syllable sound hewn from granite. Please, we are aware of your presence. We require sanctuary for this night alone. Tobias placed his palm against the door, sensing the tremor of their voices through the wood. 8 years of isolation had trained him to rely on intuition, and presently every instinct shrieked of peril, not from these women themselves, but from whatever had driven them to his door amid a tempest that could claim a life within minutes. He recalled Sarah, how she would chide him for his wariness of strangers, how she'd declare that compassion was the sole distinction between them and beasts. But Sarah was gone, and compassion had perished with her on a morning when he'd trusted the wrong individuals. The voice returned nearer to the portal now, as if the speaker had pressed her features against the timber. They approach. Should you refuse aid, we shall perish here. And when they discover our corpses at your gate, you too shall die. Tobias's hand wavered over the iron bar, securing his entrance. In 8 years, he had never removed it for anyone. But something in that voice, a certainty that made his gut clench, told him that tonight everything would transform. Because somewhere in the blackness, beyond his ranch, horsemen were drawing near. And once they arrived, there would be no return to the existence he'd constructed in the shadows. The iron bar felt heavier than it should. When Tobias finally raised it from its supports, 8 years of corrosion and terror seemed to resist his choice. But the desperation in that woman's voice had pierced his defenses like steel through parchment. The door groaned open, revealing a vision that would plague him for his remaining days. 10 Apache women huddled against his porch, their ceremonial garments torn and soiled, some bearing injuries that stained dark against the dampened cloth. The youngest appeared no more than 16, grasping a bundle that stirred slightly, an infant barely surviving in the chill. The eldest bore silver streaks through her black tresses and eyes that had witnessed excessive death. But the woman who had spoken through the door commanded his focus. She stood somewhat apart from the others, her chin elevated despite the exhaustion carved into every feature. Blood seeped from a gash above her left eye, and her dress was ripped at the shoulder. Yet her stare met his without wavering. "I am Ayana," she stated, her English measured but distinct. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have fled for 3 days." Tobias parted his lips to speak, then sealed them. Questions flooded his mind. Their origin, why they travel alone, what manner of men pursue them. But the sight of the infant's pale lips silenced his inquiries. Some matters held greater importance than answers. "Enter," he heard himself declare, retreating from a threshold. Swiftly, they moved like phantoms, filing past him into the warmth of his main chamber. Tobias had forgotten how confined his dwelling felt with others present. For 8 years it had served as his stronghold, his haven from a world that had claimed everything. Now it seemed to contract around these women who brought with them the scent of rain and terror and something else. The metallic odor of blood not entirely their own. Ayana entered last, and as she passed, she spoke barely above a whisper. "The soldiers pursuing us trail not far behind. Perhaps an hour, perhaps less. They will not cease until each of us lies dead." Tobias sealed the door and replaced the bar, knowing it was likely futile now. His sanctuary had been compromised not by force, but by choice, and consequences would follow. They always did. "Why?" he asked, turning to face Ayana. "Why do they hunt you?" Her dark eyes found his, and within them he recognized familiar anguish, the expression of someone who had lost everything yet lived to speak of it. "Because we fled instead of dying silently. Because we chose existence when they expected acceptance of death. Because some of us resisted when they burned our settlement and slaughtered our men." The infant in the young woman's arms made a feeble sound, and Ayana's jaw hardened. "And because one of their officers will see no dawn if we survive to tell what he did to my youngest sister." Tobias felt something cold settle in his belly. He'd known soldiers of that kind. Men who wore uniforms but had forgotten honor's meaning. Men who took what they desired and killed anyone who might speak of it later. "How many approach?" he asked. 8, perhaps 10. Led by a captain named Morrison. He has hunted Apache settlements for months, claiming we are hostile. But his true enemy is anyone who might report what manner of man he truly is." Tobias moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters at the storm-battered darkness beyond his fence. Nothing stirred that he could observe, but that signified little. Professional killers knew how to move unseen, especially when they believed their quarry trapped. He turned back to the women now gathered near his fireplace. Some tended injuries, while others consoled the youngest among them. They appeared as survivors, not warriors. But he'd learned long past that survival sometimes demanded a man become something he'd never intended to be. "There exists a cellar beneath the kitchen," he told Ayana. "Stone walls concealed entrance. It might accommodate all of you, though it will be tight." She shook her head slowly. "If they search and discover us, you perish with us. If they find an empty house with evidence that people sheltered here, they might believe you uninvolved. We will not make you an adversary of the United States Army." Tobias nearly laughed. 8 years too late for that discussion. "Lady, I became their enemy the day I chose to survive what they did to my family. The sole question now is whether we flee or whether we make them pay for coming here." Something flickered in Ayana's eyes. Surprise, recognition, perhaps even hope. Outside, the storm was beginning to diminish, and with it the cover that had protected them thus far, because in the distance, barely audible over the dying wind, came a sound of horses moving through mud and the low voices of men who believed they had their prey cornered. The sound of approaching horses sliced through the storm like a death warrant. Tobias moved with the efficiency of a man who had survived by thinking 3 steps ahead, seizing his rifle and a box of ammunition from the cabinet. But as he turned back to the women, he saw something that froze him. Ayanna was no longer the desperate refugee who had pleaded at his door. She stood differently now, her posture erect and commanding, and in her hands was a blade that gleamed with more than just firelight. The other women had transformed as well, some clutching weapons they'd concealed beneath their torn garments, others positioning themselves with the practiced ease of people who had fought before. "You are not defenseless," Tobias said, comprehension washing over him. "We never were," Ayanna replied, her voice carrying a hardness that matched the steel in her grasp. "But sometimes it serves to let men believe what they wish to believe. Captain Morrison thinks he pursues frightened women who will cower and plead. He is about to discover otherwise." The youngest woman with the infant moved toward the rear of the house without instruction, and 2 others followed her. They knew their purpose, had prepared for this moment. Tobias realized he wasn't sheltering helpless refugees. He was harboring warriors who had been playing a longer game than he'd comprehended. "How many men have you killed?" he asked Ayanna directly. Her dark eyes met his without shame. "Sufficient to know that Morrison soldiers are not the first to underestimate Apache women. They will not be the last, but they may be the most surprised." Outside, the voices grew clearer, men calling to each other through the rain, coordinating their approach. Tobias could distinguish at least 6 distinct voices, perhaps more, professional soldiers, but operating in terrain they didn't understand, hunting prey they had completely misjudged. "The cellar," Tobias said again, but Ayanna shook her head. "We flee now and they pursue us forever. We hide and they search until they locate us. But if we end this here tonight, the hunting ceases." Tobias felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. The cold clarity that preceded violence when survival stripped away everything except what needed accomplishing. These women hadn't come to his ranch by accident. They'd chosen this ground, this night, this storm. They'd brought their war to his doorstep because they knew exactly what kind of man he used to be. "What do you require from me?" he asked. Ayanna's smile was sharp as her blade. "Captain Morrison expects to find helpless women. Instead, he will find us. But when his men see a white rancher fighting alongside Apache, they will hesitate. That hesitation will cost them everything." A horse whinnied close to the house, and heavy boots splashed through the mud outside. Someone was moving around the building, checking for exits, planning their assault. In minutes, they would be inside, expecting to find cowering victims. Tobias checked his rifle, ensuring a round was chambered. Sarah's voice whispered in his memory, reminding him that kindness was what separated them from animals. But kindness, he was learning, sometimes with a face of violence when it was the only thing standing between innocence and evil. "There's another matter," Ayanna said quietly. "When this concludes, if we survive, you cannot remain here. Morrison's death will bring inquiries, investigations. They will come seeking answers." Tobias nodded. He'd known that the moment he'd opened his door, 8 years of peace was ending tonight. But perhaps that was how it was meant to be. Perhaps some men weren't meant to hide from the world forever. Outside, a voice rang through the storm, commanding, arrogant, certain of victory. "I know you're in there. Come out now, and we'll make this quick." Captain Morrison had arrived, and he was about to discover that some hunts end with the hunter becoming the prey. Tobias positioned himself at the front window while Ayanna and 3 other women spread throughout the main room, invisible in the shadows cast by the dying fire. The remaining women had melted into the back of the house, creating multiple lines of defense that would confuse any assault. These weren't desperate refugees. They were a coordinated war party that had been planning this confrontation for days. "Rancher," Morrison's voice boomed again. "We're tracking dangerous fugitives. Open this door, or we'll assume you're harboring enemies of the United States." Through the shutters, Tobias could see shapes moving in the darkness, soldiers spreading out around his house, taking positions that would prevent escape. Standard military tactics. But they were operating under false assumptions. They thought they were surrounding a cabin full of frightened women, and maybe one sympathetic rancher. Ayanna appeared beside him, moving so silently he didn't hear her approach. "The one by the barn," she whispered. "He is Sergeant Blake. He was there when they killed my husband. The one near your well, that is Corporal Hayes. He held my sister down while Morrison—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tobias felt something dark and familiar rise in his chest. The same cold rage that had sustained him through 8 years of isolation. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were predators in uniform. And predators understood only one language. "How do you want to do this?" he asked. "Morrison will come through the front door. He always does. He wants to see the fear in his victims' eyes. His men will come through the back and sides, but they expect to find women too frightened to fight and a rancher too scared to resist." She handed him something, a small mirror polished to shine. "When you see the signal, take Morrison. We will handle the rest." Tobias was about to ask what signal when a new voice cut through the storm. Young, uncertain, nothing like the harsh commands they'd been hearing. "Captain, sir, maybe we should just search the place and move on. Could be just some old rancher riding out the storm." Morrison's laugh was ugly. "Private Wilson, those tracks led right to this door. 10 women moving fast, bleeding in at least 3 places. They're in there, and so is anyone stupid enough to help them. We do this by the book, my book." Tobias heard the unmistakable sound of rifles being readied, safeties clicking off. Whatever was about to happen, it was happening now. If you were Tobias, what would you do? Open the door and try to negotiate with men who had already decided to kill everyone inside? Or trust these Apache women who had turned his sanctuary into a battlefield? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Tobias decided next would determine whether justice or murder ruled this night. He made his choice. The front door exploded inward as Morrison kicked it open, his rifle raised and ready. But instead of finding cowering women, he found himself staring down the barrel of Tobias's Winchester. For a split second, confusion flickered across the captain's face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. A second of hesitation was all Ayanna needed. The mirror flashed in the firelight, reflecting a signal to positions throughout the house. The storm that had hidden the soldiers' approach now muffled the sounds of what followed. The whisper of blades finding their targets, the muffled grunts of men who died before they could scream, and the wet sounds of justice being served with Apache steel. Morrison's eyes widened as he understood he'd walked into a trap, but understanding came too late. Tobias's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Ayanna appeared behind the captain like a shadow given form. "This is for my sister," she whispered in Morrison's ear, her blade sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. Morrison dropped his rifle, his hands clutching at the wound. But Ayanna wasn't finished. She wanted him to see her face, to know who had brought him justice. "And this is for every woman you thought was too weak to fight back. But as Morrison fell, a new sound reached them through the storm. More horses, more voices. Morrison hadn't come alone, after all. Somewhere in the darkness, reinforcements were approaching, and the real battle was just beginning. The sound of approaching reinforcements turned Tobias's blood to ice. Through the broken doorway, he could see torch flames dancing in the darkness. At least a dozen riders, maybe more. Morrison had been the advance party, not the main force. The real army was just arriving. Ayanna pulled her blade free from Morrison's chest, her face grim as she processed what they were hearing. Around the house, her women appeared from the shadows like ghosts, each confirming what Tobias already knew. Morrison's original squad was dead, but their victory had lasted exactly 30 seconds. How many? Ayanna asked the woman who materialized beside her. 15 riders, maybe 20. They heard the gunshot. They know something went wrong. Tobias felt the familiar burden of impossible decisions weighing upon him. Battle and perish or yield and die more slowly. Yet as he observed these women who had transformed his refuge into a war zone, he recognized there might be a third alternative, one requiring him to become the man he'd been before sorrow had made him a recluse. The cellar, he said quickly, not for concealment, but to endure what approaches next. Ayanna declined with a shake of her head. We cannot flee from these numbers. They will pursue us across 3 territories. We're not fleeing, Tobias responded, moving toward a cabinet unopened for 8 years. Within, wrapped in oiled fabric, lay items he'd prayed never to handle again. Explosives, fuses, the implements of a man who'd once demolished mountainsides for railroad construction, and later other purposes when war demanded it. My homestead sits upon her eyes, he explained, his hands working automatically to ready charges. Natural drainage flows down both flanks. When spring torrents arrive, all that water must go somewhere. Comprehension sparked in Ayanna's eyes. The dam. Tobias nodded. I constructed it to manage flooding, but destroy it during a tempest like this. He gestured toward the advancing torches. That valley fills with 10 feet of water within minutes. Anyone trapped below perishes. But we would be destroying your home, your land, Ayanna concluded. Tobias surveyed the cabin that had served as his prison for 8 years, then at Morrison's corpse cooling upon his floor. Home was no longer a location. It was a decision, and his decision was ensuring these women lived to see morning. Some matters hold greater importance than possessions, he declared, echoing words Sarah once spoke when he'd grown too attached to material things. Outside, the voices drew nearer, commands being bellowed, positions being established. Someone had discovered Morrison's body by now, witnessed the blood, understood that their easy prey had become something entirely different. The youngest woman emerged with the infant, who had somehow slumbered through the violence. But now the child was alert, dark eyes wide and attentive as if sensing the tension filling the air. Lieutenant Morrison is deceased, a voice roared from outside. Surrender immediately, or we shall burn you out. Ayanna regarded Tobias, her expression unreadable. If we proceed with this, there exists no return. You will be a fugitive for your remaining days. Tobias shouldered his rifle and gathered the prepared charges. Lady, I've been a dead man for 8 years. Tonight I'm choosing to exist again. But as they prepared to depart through the rear entrance, a new sound halted them completely. The wail of an infant, not the one in their arms, but another somewhere out in the storm. One of the soldiers had brought a child with him, because sometimes the most monstrous predators hide behind the most innocent shields. And the most difficult choices test how far a man will venture to save those who matter most. The cry of that distant baby altered everything. Tobias froze midway to the back door, the dynamite suddenly feeling like lead in his grasp. Through the shattered front entrance, torchlight danced across Morrison's body, and somewhere beyond that illumination, an innocent child was trapped in the midst of a war that had nothing to do with him. Ayanna seized his arm, her grip iron-strong. It could be deception. Soldiers have employed such tactics before. But Tobias shook his head. He'd heard too many genuine cries in his life to mistake the authentic terror in that small voice. Someone out there, likely one of Morrison's men, had brought their own child on what they'd anticipated being a simple murder mission. Now that child was about to suffer for their father's transgressions. "We cannot detonate the dam," he said quietly. "Not with a baby down there." "Then we all perish," one of the other women hissed. "My daughter's life matters equally to that one." She spoke truth, and Tobias knew it. But some boundaries, once crossed, transform a man forever. He'd been walking the edge of that line for 8 years, and tonight he either stepped back or fell off completely. "There exists another method," he said, setting down the explosives. "More difficult, more perilous, but it keeps everyone breathing." Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "We make them believe we're trapped. Make them overconfident. They'll dispatch men to flush us out, while the remainder stay back with the horses." He paused. "And whoever brought that baby, that leaves us outnumbered 3-1. In a fair fight, yes, but this won't be fair." Tobias moved to another cabinet, this one containing items that spoke to a different kind of warfare. Caltrops, iron spikes designed to stop horses, tripwires that could snap a man's neck in darkness, and bear traps that had never seen a bear, but had tasted human flesh during the war. 8 years ago, I transformed this place into a fortress because I feared dying. Tonight, we're going to use those defenses to ensure other people survive. Outside, the voices were organizing. Someone was assuming command, probably Morrison second. Orders were being issued, positions assigned. They possessed numbers and training. But they were operating in darkness on ground Tobias knew like his own pulse. "How do we separate them?" Ayanna asked. "We provide what they anticipate. A final stand, barricade the front, create noise, make them believe we're cornered and desperate. Half their force will come for us. The other half will remain back to secure the retreat route." And then Tobias smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Then we demonstrate the difference between hunting frightened women and fighting people who've got nothing left to lose." The strategy was simple, brutal, and completely mad. Ayanna and 4 women would create a diversion at the house front, making sufficient noise to attract the assault team. Meanwhile, Tobias and the remaining women would circle around through terrain only he knew, targeting the reserve force and hopefully getting that baby to safety. "If this fails," Ayanna said, as they prepared to separate, "Morrison's death will mean nothing. They will portray us as savage murderers and use our bodies to justify 10 more raids." "And if we do nothing," Tobias replied, "that baby out there dies for its father's crimes. And you all die for the crime of wanting to live. Sometimes the only choice is between bad and worse." If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The baby's cry came again weaker now, and Tobias felt time slipping away like water through his fingers. Every second they delayed was another second closer to a child's death, another moment that would haunt him if he survived this night. "Move," he whispered, as Ayanna and her team took positions at the front of the house. Tobias led the others into the storm through his back door. The rain was lighter now, but the ground was treacherous, and one mistake would alert the soldiers to their flanking maneuver. But as they crept through the darkness toward the sound of horses and hushed voices, Tobias realized he'd made a critical error in judgment. The baby wasn't with the reserve force. It was much closer to the house, somewhere between the two groups, which meant saving the child would require walking directly into the crossfire. The baby's cries were coming from a wagon positioned between the house and the soldiers' main camp. As Tobias crept closer through the mud and darkness, he could make out the shape of a military supply cart, and beside it, a woman hunched over something small and moving, not a soldier's wife. This woman wore the rough clothes of a camp follower, probably a laundress or cook who'd been forced to bring her child on what should have been a simple mission. Tobias signaled for the Apache women with him to hold position while he moved closer. Through the rain, he could hear the woman's desperate whispers as she tried to calm the crying infant. She was trapped between two forces about to collide, with nowhere to run and no way to protect her child from what was coming. From the house came the sound of Ayana's distraction, gunshots, shouting, the crash of furniture being overturned. It was working. Through the darkness, Tobias could see soldiers moving toward the house, leaving the supply area lightly guarded. But lightly still meant 3 armed men who would shoot anything that moved. He made his decision. Rising from cover, Tobias walked directly toward the wagon, his rifle held low but ready. The nearest guard spotted him immediately, raising his weapon. But Tobias called out in a voice that carried calm authority. "Easy, soldier. Lieutenant Morrison sent me to secure the civilians." The lie bought him precious seconds. In the darkness and chaos, wearing his dark coat, he could pass for military at a distance. By the time the guard realized his mistake, Tobias was close enough that shouting would bring attention neither of them wanted. "You're not Army," the soldier said, but his voice held uncertainty rather than alarm. "No," Tobias agreed, and struck the man across the temple with his rifle, but the soldier dropped silently into the mud. The woman with the baby looked up as Tobias approached, terror bright in her eyes. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 19, with a hollow look of someone who'd seen too much hardship for her years. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt my baby. She's done nothing wrong." "Neither have you," Tobias said quietly. "What's your name?" "Mary. Mary Hendricks. I cook for the men, do their washing. Captain Morrison said it would be safe. Said we were just going to arrest some women who'd stolen horses." Tobias felt anger burn in his chest. Morrison had lied to his own people, turned a cook and her baby into unwitting accessories to murder. Even dead, the man was still destroying lives. "Mary, I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" She nodded frantically, clutching her baby closer. "There's going to be more shooting in a minute. When it starts, you run toward that grove of trees and keep running until you can't hear the guns anymore. Follow the creek downstream. It leads to a trading post about 5 miles south. Tell them Tobias Redmont sent you." "What about you?" she asked. Before Tobias could answer, the remaining guards spotted him. One shouted a warning while the other raised his rifle. But the Apache women Tobias had left in position were already moving, emerging from the darkness like vengeful spirits. The fight was brief and decisive. These soldiers had expected to face frightened refugees, not experienced warriors who'd been planning their revenge for days. Within minutes, the supply area was secure, and Mary was running into the night with her baby, disappearing into the safety of the storm. But their victory was short-lived. From the direction of the house came a new sound, not gunfire, but something worse, silence. Either Ayana's group had won completely, or they were all dead. Rising above the dying storm, a new voice called out with cold authority. This is Colonel Bradley, United States Army. You are surrounded by a full company of soldiers. Surrender now, or we will burn you out and hang the survivors." Tobias felt his blood turn to ice. Morrison hadn't been the real leader after all. Somewhere in the darkness, a much more dangerous enemy had been watching, waiting, letting others do the dying while he positioned his forces for the killing blow. Colonel Bradley's voice carried the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Through the darkness, Tobias could see torches spreading out in a wide circle around his property. Not the dozen riders they'd originally faced, but what looked like a full military operation. Morrison had been the bait, and they'd all walked straight into the trap. But as Tobias processed this new threat, he heard something that changed everything. Ayana's voice calling from the direction of the house. "Tobias, we have Bradley's son." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting to see how this would unfold. Then Bradley's voice came again, but now it carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Release the boy, and we can discuss terms." "There are no terms," Ayana shouted back. "Only justice. Your men destroyed our village, murdered our families, and worse. Now you will answer for their crimes." Tobias made his way back toward the house, moving carefully through terrain that was now a maze of soldiers and position weapons. As he got closer, he could see the situation more clearly. Ayana's group had indeed won their fight, but at a cost. 2 of the Apache women lay still in the mud, their sacrifice buying the others a chance at survival. Inside the house, he found a scene that would have been impossible to imagine an hour earlier. Ayana stood behind a young man in a lieutenant's uniform, her knife pressed to his throat. The boy, and he was barely more than a boy, had Bradley's eyes and the same aristocratic jaw. But where his father projected cold authority, the son showed only terror. "He came through the back," Ayana explained quietly. "Thought he was being clever, flanking us while his father's men attacked the front. Instead, he delivered himself to us." The young lieutenant tried to speak, but Ayana's blade pressed closer to his skin, drawing a thin line of blood. "How old are you?" Tobias asked the boy. 19, came the whispered reply. "Same age as the cook's daughter who just ran into the night because your father turned her into a target. Same age as some of the women your captain murdered." Tobias moved closer, studying the boy's face. "Tell me, Lieutenant Bradley, did you know what Morrison was really doing to those villages?" The young man's eyes flickered between Tobias and Ayana. Understanding was finally dawning. "I thought we were suppressing hostile Indians. Father said they were raiders, that we were protecting settlers." "Your father lied," Ayana said softly. "We were living peacefully until Morrison came. We grew corn, raised children, and bothered no one. But peaceful Indians don't justify military budgets, do they?" Outside, Bradley's voice came again, more desperate now. "I have 60 men surrounding this house. Release my son, and I'll give you safe passage to the territorial border." Tobias almost laughed. Safe passage from a man who'd built his career on broken promises and manufactured wars. But as he looked at the young lieutenant, he saw something that gave him pause. Genuine shock and growing horror as the boy began to understand what he'd been part of. "There's another way," Tobias said to Ayana. "One that doesn't require his death. He is guilty by association. His ignorance does not absolve him. No, but his testimony might convict his father." The idea crystallized as he spoke. A colonel's son testifying about systematic murder disguised as military action. It would destroy Bradley's career and expose the corruption that had enabled men like Morrison. "You want me to betray my father?" the young lieutenant whispered. "I want you to tell the truth," Tobias replied. The question is whether you're man enough to face what that truth means. Before anyone could respond, a new sound cut through the night, horses approaching at full gallop, and with them, voices shouting orders that didn't come from Bradley's men. Someone else was arriving, someone with enough authority to make a full colonel nervous. Through the broken door, Tobias could see new torches, carried by riders wearing different uniforms. Federal marshals, maybe, or territorial investigators. Someone had been watching Bradley's operations, and tonight's massacre had finally drawn official attention. As understanding dawned, Tobias realized they might all survive this after all. But survival would come with a price. The truth would have to be told, justice would have to be served, and powerful men would have to fall. Young Lieutenant Bradley looked between his captors and the approaching reinforcements, then at his own reflection in the blade still pressed to his throat. "What do you need me to say?" he whispered. "If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." Dawn broke over Tobias Redmont's ranch 6 hours later, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for a night that had ended one kind of war and started another. The federal investigators had listened to Lieutenant Bradley's testimony with growing horror, documenting crimes that reached far beyond Morrison's unit and implicated officials all the way to the territorial capital. Colonel Bradley was led away in chains, his military career destroyed by his own son's courage to speak the truth. The surviving Apache women were granted federal protection and compensation for their losses, though no amount of money could restore their murdered families. Tobias stood in the doorway of his ruined home, watching Ayanna prepare to leave with her people. The babies they'd saved, both the Apache child and Mary Hendricks' daughter, had survived the night, though the cost in other lives had been terrible. "Where will you go?" he asked Ayanna. "North, to relatives who escaped Bradley's campaign. We will rebuild, but not here. This place holds too much blood now." She paused, studying his face. "What about you? Your home is destroyed. Your solitude ended. The man who lived alone for 8 years died tonight." Tobias nodded. She was right. The hermit who'd hidden from the world was gone, replaced by someone who remembered that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. "I think I'll head west," he said. "Find some place that needs a man who knows how to build things and isn't afraid to defend them." Ayanna smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "That cook, Mary Hendricks. She will need protection until she reaches her family in Denver. The trail is dangerous for a woman alone with a baby." Tobias understood. His first act, as a man reborn, wouldn't be running toward a new life, but ensuring others reached there safely. As the Apache women rode north toward hope, and Tobias prepared to ride west toward redemption, the sun climbed higher over a ranch that had seen too much death and just enough justice. Sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of another, and sometimes a man who thought he was finished with living discovered he was just getting started. Years later, travelers would tell stories of the night 10 Apache women and one lonely rancher stood against an army and won. But those who lived it knew the truth was simpler and more complex. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong, but between staying safe and staying human. And sometimes when the choice matters most, being human is the only thing that really counts. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video.